The obstacle that we focus on at Global Rights for Women is another very, very effective tool in keeping women and girls subjugated, isolated, afraid, keep them from going to school, keep them from rising in their professions and being leaders, and that's violence against women. And so that's why our organization has chosen to focus on that as a key strategy, as a key focus, and building global partnerships around that. So these are some of the countries that Global Rights for Women has worked in over the past 3 years. I have been, as Kathleen said, working on women's human rights and violence against women for most of my career. I started this work in 1993, and that was before Hillary Clinton stood up at the Fourth World Conference on Women in Beijing, China, and said, women's rights are human rights, and violence against women is a human rights violation. That was the world we had at that time. That was a world where the United Nations had not acknowledged in any formal way that women's rights were human rights, and certainly not that violence against women in its many forms was a human rights violation. So in these 25 years, that has changed, and I'm going to be talking about that. So I'll say a little bit about the problem of violence against women internationally. Then I will talk about how a US-based group like ours works with partners around the world. I'll talk about why that works, carrying through the themes of your president. Why are those global partnerships so important? Why do we need them? And then what some of the institutions that provide the forum for these, where women can get together and develop these partnerships and carry out their work in the context of them. I would like to leave a significant amount of time for questions, if that's okay. Actually, I was supposed to start at 3:15. How long would you like me to go, Kathleen? I'll just be...
Well, we had slotted an hour.
Okay.
Is that okay, Faith?
Okay.
Yep.
We have a long reception time, so.
Okay, we're okay then.
Yeah.
And I won't talk that long. I don't think that's really helpful. You'll get bored.
Yeah.
But what I would really like to do is leave at least 20 minutes for questions. So be thinking about that. I'm happy to answer. You'll be able to tell that I can talk forever about any angle of this subject. I love talking about it. I love answering questions about how this work gets done, how did it start, why the UN, why the Council of Europe, all these things I'm going to talk about that aren't always immediately apparent to the audience. I'm happy to go any angle you would like to go. This is Rashida Manjoo. She was the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women, and her mandate was up just a couple years ago. She served for about 6 years, and she was just particularly eloquent when it came to her speaking and talking about how this pandemic of violence against women and girls around the world affects not only, tragically, the women and girls themselves and their families, but how it undermines the health of neighborhoods, communities, ultimately national governments, and in turn the entire world. She's very eloquent in talking about that. And while when I started this work, as when Rashida started, there were really no statistics about that violence. We knew it because so many women that we know in our lives have experienced this violence. And I would venture to say nobody in this room doesn't either have a personal experience with some form of violence, or the family member, sister, friend, cousin, aunt, grandmother has had that. It's just everywhere. There has been some progress on this accountability issue that Rashida speaks about in this quote. There is more attention now by governments and NGOs like my NGO and IGOs, and there are studies that just were not available before. When I started this work, there wasn't the kind of attention that there is now. So these sobering statistics, I just pulled together a few of them, and they are coming out more and more and more as the issue of women's human rights and violence against women is raising up to the level of more prominence and being looked at by those in power. That first statistic is from the World Health Organization in 2013. IPV, some of you may know, is the term for intimate partner violence, sometimes domestic violence. It's family violence. That term is used in different ways. That second figure comes from the European Union Agency for Fundamental Human Rights. I can remember when that study came out in 2014, and it was the first of its kind in Europe 3 years ago. They had not studied that issue in the way that we have a lot of problems, yes, in the United States, but we have been collecting statistics and working on this issue of physical and sexual violence in this country for 40 years now. And I'll talk about that just a little bit. And then that last statistic is a Center for Disease Control statistic. Now that's their 2010 statistic. I think there may be even a more recent one, but they have been keeping track of this kind of violence against women and girls in our country. So the types of, when I say violence against women and girls, what am I talking about? I talk about intimate partner violence. Certainly that is among many who have studied the issue, believe that that is the most pervasive form of violence against women that it is in the world. And that has been my experience also. When I have traveled around the world, I have probably been to I need to do an official count at some point, but 50 or 60 countries over the last 25 years. And the women who are focused on violence against women and women's human rights, and when they know that this is our area of expertise, they want us to help them with domestic violence and intimate partner violence. They believe that is the most devastating form of violence that they're facing. Now, within that, you can see in these forms of violence, some of those fall right within that context. Certainly sexual assault is a huge part of intimate partner violence, as well as stranger assaults and assaults in the workplace, and what you hear about in the news all the time now. Child marriage can really be considered a form of family violence because it's oftentimes a parent marrying off a young girl to an older man. Honor killings can be obviously family violence. Female genital mutilation is often perpetrated by women, even in the family. But these are just some of the issues that we encounter in our work around the world when we work with partners to end violence and as I said, create new laws and enforce those laws on violence against women. I will never forget a United Nations expert group meeting in Ethiopia that I went to in 2009, and our task there was actually another meeting of women from around the world who were brought together to focus on developing some legal standards that could be adapted into laws. And the title of our task was legislation on harmful practices on violence against women and girls. And there were so many forms of violence that were brought to the table at that conference in Ethiopia, that some that I had never even heard of at that point, like breast ironing or leveret and sororate, where a woman's husband dies and she's automatically becomes the property of, some of you are nodding your heads, but so many forms of violence around the world that we don't even often know about. I think that's changing. Even in the U.S., in Minnesota, where I come from, we have very significant immigrant populations from East and West Africa. We have Latina women are a significant part of our population, Southeast Asia. Some of these practices, like female genital mutilation, are now becoming the focus of attention of more of our members of our community. We actually have legislation now in Minnesota that prohibits female genital mutilation. There are states around our country that are examining their own laws on child marriage. Interestingly enough, we're just seeing that in our courts more and more. Parents bringing young girls into courtrooms to get permission to marry a child, a girl, might be 14, 15, 16. And in Minnesota, if the parents agree and the judge approves it, I'm trying to remember if there's any limit. I think they can be married very young. And so the women's advocates all around the country are starting to look at those laws and to say, what do we stand for in this country when it comes to women's human rights? And where is it that this line is drawn between respecting cultures and respecting the human rights of women and girls? So all these issues are not only, they're everywhere. We're seeing them in our own communities and other parts of the world and manifested differently, of course, but so much commonality. So violence and global partnerships. And it was really fun to listen to your president's talk on this one, because I was just kind of jumping out of my seat. The issue of violence against women is so natural for global partnerships. And I have just felt this so deeply and growing over the 25 years that I've worked in this area with partners around the world. The commonality of experience is striking. I can talk to a privileged, resourced, educated woman in the suburb of Minneapolis, and she will say the same things about her experience of domestic violence as the colleague of our partner in Rabat, Morocco, who has no resources, is uneducated, can't read, poor. They will talk about the shame, the fear, the isolation, the tactics, the control that their husbands use. If they're talking about sexual assault, the shame, the fear, the embarrassment, the lack of response by a police officer or a prosecutor. It's striking. I mean, here we are supposedly so different from country to country, and yet when we talk about violence against women, we do it with a common voice. I was at a conference in Miami not too long ago where we got together a group of women from Latin America, and one of our Puerto Rican sisters, an activist there who was serving victims of violence in Puerto Rico, stood up in tears at one point. There were probably 15 countries represented in that room, and said this. I listened to the stories in this room, and I realized that violence is what bonds us as women together throughout the world. And it was a moment, there was just silence in the room with this realization that with all of our differences, some language differences, all of this, we shared this. The dynamics of it, the barriers that we face in addressing it, the challenges that we get in our legislatures, and the feelings we have deeply in our hearts about it. The advantages of global partnerships. My friend Catherine Sicking, do any of you know of Catherine? She's a political science professor at Harvard, and actually for years was in Minnesota, and has studied global partnerships. She has a wonderful book, old now, Activists Beyond Borders, Advocacy Networks in International Politics. And one of the subjects she studied, one was, I think there was a landmine chapter and possibly an environmental chapter, but one chapter was about violence against women. It's a wonderful chapter if you get the chance to read it. But this is, of course, a powerful one that we heard from our speaker before. It amplifies issues. When people are saying the same thing across borders, that issue is raised up in visibility, not only nationally, but internationally. These are four, on the next slide, I've got four advantages that I have focused on only over the years. The strength of that global partnership is very much in so many of the dynamics that are different with one partner and the other partner, and yet with that shared value bringing us together. But we can't as American lawyers go to Tajikistan or Armenia and write a law and get it passed and get the police to enforce it. That's not possible. The local knowledge, expertise, and vision of the community part is what drives all of our work at Global Rights for Women. We go nowhere. This has been my philosophy since I've been working in this area since 1993, that we go where we're invited. And the beauty is that now, unlike 1993, everywhere we travel, there are powerful, sophisticated women's groups working on the issue of violence against women, and they know what they need from an international partner like us. And they guide the way. So that first bullet point runs into the second. The capacity of the local partner for hands-on advocacy. They know the police chief. They know the legislator or the parliamentarian that can push things forward. We can't do that. What we can do, we can bring increased visibility, like we heard about before and Catherine Sicking talks about in her book. Increased visibility brought by international partners is profound. I will be going to Lithuania in a few weeks to talk with their Ministry of Justice and Internal Affairs, these are all the legal professionals, about the implementation of their domestic violence law, which passed in 2013. I probably won't say a whole lot of different things than my brilliant NGO partner, Vilana Pilankate Sotorovich, because she's articulate, she knows exactly what the law says, she has ideas about how to implement it, but when I come as an international figure and say these words and show the support that she has from the international community and talk about it in these ways, her voice is more visible and louder for them. The other very strong factor that really has driven so much of the work that I have done from Minnesota and our colleagues have done from Minnesota is the experience in long-standing, not only domestic violence legal reform, but sexual assault and human sex trafficking and sexual harassment. That original legal reform on sexual harassment, on sexual assault, on domestic violence in particular, started in the United States of America 40 years ago. There wasn't a lot going on around in the rest of the world on legal reform, changes laws on violence against women back then. Now, like I said, that's all changed, but there were efforts in the UK, there were some in New Zealand and Australia, but we opened the first shelter in St. Paul, Minnesota in 1972. We passed the third dedicated domestic violence law after Massachusetts and Pennsylvania in Minnesota in 1979. In the past 5, 10, 15 years, all over the world, you will see domestic abuse acts, for example, with a new order for protection remedy that nobody has ever had before. This is Lithuania, member of the European Union, just passed an order for protection remedy in 2013. The one very similar to what we passed in 1979. And before that were the amendments to our criminal code that allowed police and prosecutors. So our international partners value this experience. They want to hear, oftentimes from a Minnesota police officer who's talking to their Lithuanian or Armenian or Georgian police officers, what it's like to arrest a batterer, what it's like to interview a victim of sexual assault after she's just been assaulted, what it's like to collect evidence in those cases, because they haven't done it before. And it is rare. It's still rare. It's less rare for police now to be intervening in these cases. They are often the ones that actually drive this along with the NGO advocates. But we, very few, I know this sounds like a terrible generalization, but it's true. Very few cases of violence against women and girls, sexual assault, domestic violence, sexual harassment get prosecuted at all in the world. That is a fair statement. So And you look at, I was reading the newspaper and about Harvey Weinstein, our friend in New York or California, wherever he is. And we were hearing all about these sexual harassment cases. And then now, in today's news, he had at least, there were more than one, cases of criminal sexual assault that he has been accused of. And in fact, at least one of those young women went to the police, and the police wrote a detailed report, and the case never got prosecuted. It was in New York, and who's the prosecutor there?
Cyrus Vance.
Cyrus Vance.
Oh my God.
It's, it's inconceivable to me what happened. And so anyway, we can talk all longer about what happened with Harvey Weinstein, but let me just say a few more things about some of the forums where they had, just a few of them obviously have had the effect of raising the profile of violence against women and girls within the broader context of women's human rights, and providing forums for us to come together at the policy level and talk about these issues and bring them into to a higher level of discussion. And there's others. There's the World Bank. There's I think about the conference that's going on at the end of October, Women Against Violence Europe. That has just broadened from a tiny little group of us years ago, and now there were 250, 300 people in Budapest last year for a 3-day conference, and at the end we were all dancing and yeah, thank you. Okay, so there's lots of these cross-border partnerships are forming, and I so agree with our previous speaker that it's so essential to our work. She said national policies are inextricably linked to global policies. And when you said that, I thought, it just struck me that the European Union, after the fall of the Soviet Union, and there was this pull, and there was lots of movement towards those countries getting into the European Union. And of course now we're seeing lots of other dynamics in the Caucasus and Baltics and all that with Russia. But then there was really this excitement about those countries getting into the European Union. And one of the things that the European Union did very soon after, as the United Nations rose the profile of violence against women, you had to have a law. You had to have a law on domestic violence in order to get into the European Union. So, perfect example of a national policy being inextricably tied to a global one. Just quickly, 10 minutes.
Well,
Two questions.
Yeah,
Okay.
so we have questions.
Yeah. Interesting fact, many of you may know this, but the United Nations International Human Rights Treaties don't address violence against women, kind of period. Now, there's a lot of work being done toward that, but some of you are familiar maybe with the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, and that it does not include the word violence. So they passed General Recommendation 19 to try to remedy that. Well, now they have passed a new, much more detailed, specific recommendation, General Recommendation 35. Some of you, and that's going to be launched in November. There's actually a webinar that you can go online and listen to. And I think it's at the CEDAW meeting in Geneva, and that's on November 14th. And they're going to talk all about that. And there was a wonderful outreach that they did. It was Dubravka Simonovic, now a Croatian, is the new special rapporteur on violence against women, and she's working more closely with the committee, the CEDAW committee, and they all solicited comments from NGOs around the world on what needed to be in this General Recommendation 35 so that it could better hold governments accountable for those governments that have signed on to the Women's Treaty need to be held accountable for dealing with violence, specifically in their obligations under that treaty. Some examples of regional forums is on the next slide there.
Okay.
And I know you know of these. Interestingly, we can go to the next slide. talk about the regional treaties are interesting because we don't have, as I mentioned, a separate treaty on violence against women at all. We have this effort to enhance the women's treaty going on. But we do have regional treaties that are very specific to violence. There is not a binding treaty in the Asian region yet, but way back in 1994, we had the Commission of Belinda Carrà. So there was a lot, and has been, Latin American women have been organizing around violence at least as long as we have, and achieving some pretty powerful things. The Maputo Protocol passed in 2005 in Africa. That one is a little bit more bare bones. The Convention of Belinda Carrà is much more detailed in its what governments are supposed to be doing to prevent and punish violence against women and girls. The Istanbul Convention is a work of art, relatively speaking. It's 23 pages long. It went into force in 2014. They have an enforcement committee. It's called Grevio. They've already issued their first reports when governments aren't living up to their obligations under the treaty, or they're just coming up for a regular review cycle. They have some really powerful experts who are monitoring those government compliance with that treaty. And that treaty, like I said, is very detailed. It covers almost all of those forms of violence that I had listed in that original slide. It talks about you need a civil order for protection remedy in domestic violence cases. Police and prosecutors and judges have to be trained in evidence-based prosecution. Very, very detailed. Informed, again, international policy being inextricably linked to national. This has been informed by all the work that local governments have been doing over the last 40 years, starting with the US and gradually. So now the Istanbul Convention, now we really have a treaty that is detailed and powerful and educational to not only the governments but to the people who are working to end violence against women and need to know what the legal system should be doing. It's a piece of real content. Okay, so I just thought this is one group, Every Woman Everywhere, that is working for a binding international standard on violence against women. There's been a lot of discussion over the last few years about a treaty on violence against women, and I think it's fair to say that the United Nations doesn't want another treaty, but it's really alarming in my view that there isn't an international treaty on violence against women. We think of the dozens of how many treaties we have on various things, and this most pervasive human rights violation in the world that so undermines women's growth and progress and health. We don't have a binding treaty on that. So there's going to be a lot of discussion about whether a separate, continuing forward, a separate treaty is in order, or whether again it's something like an optional protocol to the Women's Convention. But right now we just have these general recommendations that I mentioned before. Okay, I think I talked about all that, but we now have many more countries who have adopted laws on violence against women. I have seen a trend just recently. We had a lot of movement around domestic violence laws because that was so pervasive. Now we're seeing as some of these domestic violence laws begin to be implemented and growing understanding about what is happening to women in their homes. Our partners are wanting to work on revising their sexual assault laws and making them stronger so that prosecutors can really use them to hold offenders accountable. Okay, there's just a few pictures where in that one before, those are our Georgian partners. Our team actually is leaving for the Republic of Georgia on Monday, and this is an example of some of our work. These two are NGO advocates at the leading shelter in Tbilisi, Georgia, called Anti-Violence Network of Georgia. And they have had their law on domestic violence since 2006 and struggling to implement it. So we have been granted, it's wonderful to grant from the United Nations to work with them over the next few months in developing a risk assessment tool for police and prosecutors and judges that they can be using when they're implementing their law and understanding when the cases are really dangerous so that the intervention can happen quicker. The next picture, that is just recently we were in that's Moldova. Yeah, training out. So we did a 2-year project with the folks, 2 different NGOs and the U.S. Embassy in Moldova. They are wanting to rewrite their sexual assault laws and then put into practice some things that we've been doing here in the United States, like sexual assault response teams, where the community kind of frontline actors, like the nurses in the emergency room and the prosecutors and the police and the sexual violence counselors, are coordinating about how to best get women safe, certainly, but then get cases into court in a way that really protects women and make sure that the evidence is collected in a way that the prosecutors can use it. That's a huge issue in sexual assault cases. That was why the prosecutor in New York, that was the excuse he gave for not prosecuting a sexual assault case, was that the evidence wasn't good enough. Can't just believe the woman, you know. In Morocco, we've been doing some work there over the last 3 years. Morocco does not have, they want our partners, Stephanie and Saida are there in the front, in the purple shirt, and then over to the left there. They've been incredible activists leading the way for years in trying to get a comprehensive Violence Against Women Act passed in Morocco, and engaging their sisters around Morocco and with all kinds of awareness campaigns and rallies and bringing them into the parliamentarians. Still no comprehensive law passed there, but one did. Actually, that one was focused on just domestic violence in Tunisia not too long ago. So, a lot happy that Stephanie and Saida. I think I'll stop there and take your questions. I would just, there's a couple more pictures. This one, that's kind of an interesting, that last picture. This, we're doing this, now we're going to, I think, go to semi-annually, where we're bringing, we call it CCR, it's Coordinated Community Response, and it's a model of implementation of laws. We are focused on laws, but it's so easy to have, well, it's not easy, it's really hard to get laws passed, but once they're passed, it's even harder to get them enforced, to get the will of the prosecutors and the judges and the technical capacity, like I was talking about earlier, of a police officer to interview, a child or a woman who's just been beaten up. That's really hard work, and work that, as I said before, they haven't done. And these teams were from Lithuania, Latvia, Tajikistan, and Kazakhstan. And we required that in order to come to Duluth and see this groundbreaking coordinated community response model, where all these legal professionals are talking about how to implement a law, that they bring teams, that they model their delegations after what they needed to do when they went home. So it wouldn't be one NGO, poor soul, trying to go back and tell what they learned in Duluth, Minnesota. It would be a team who owned this knowledge and could be kind of a force of energy to keep the work going there. So that was April 16, and then in April of this year, we had Georgia, Armenia, I'll do it in a minute, but we were Bulgaria. So thank you for your attention, and let's have some questions.